Thanks for staying with us on the News at 1. Let's take a look at your market news now. Asian investors retreated today after the previous day's rally. This as some skepticism seeped in about the US and China being able to refrain from trade hostilities. The oil price also edged up, creating further jitters around inflation and possible further rate hikes in the United States. Japanese stocks slipped with a benchmark Nikkei Share Average sliding by 0.2%. Liquidity across Asian markets was somewhat limited today, with South Korea and Hong Kong out for public holiday. On mainland China, Shanghai saw very limited gains. The Shanghai Composite Index closed flat. US stocks rose last night after the US and China decided to put their trade differences on hold to work on a wider agreement, while sentiment was also boosted by deal activity. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 1.21%. The S&P 500 gained 0.74%, and the Nasdaq Composite Index added 0.54%. For more on the markets, we cross to Nompumelelo Siziba. She's standing by at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Good afternoon, Nompumelelo. We're seeing the rand making a recovery from that 12.80 mark that it closed on yesterday.
That's right, Nzinga. So the rand has appreciated something like 1.2, 1.3% against the US dollar. It's also appreciated quite nicely against the euro and the British pound. So, but what we're seeing generally in terms of the US dollar did tick down ever so slightly against major currencies. So obviously that's had the impact or the effect of emerging market currencies, for example, appreciating slightly. But I don't think there are any idiosyncratic reasons or any peculiar reasons from a South African perspective why the rand has actually appreciated. I think it's more a function of the dollar. But of course, I have my expert on the side who can speak to that. And in terms of what's happening on the local bourse, we see the all-share index trading in positive territory at the moment. It did start in the red, but it's now in positive territory. The markets are generally in risk-on mode, although there's a realization that the cessation of hostilities between China and the US, it may not be long-lived. In other words, problems could arise tomorrow. Having said that, though, the automobile sector is cheering today because China made an announcement to say that the import duties is going to levy are now going to be reduced from 25% to 15%. So there's some movement there. So maybe we're seeing positive moves in the right direction. Let's take a look at the indicators. I'm joined by Maudi Lentsoane. He's from Luhuma Capital. Thanks for joining us, sir, as always.
Thanks for having me.
Good stuff. Markets appear to be in risk-on mode today. What's your take?
Yeah, look, we're certainly positive, even though the JSE pretty much flat. The one sector that is doing very well, it's the financial sector. When you look into the resources sector, it is a bit muted. And we can understand, I mean, the stronger rand would obviously be negative for those sectors, but very supportive of the retail sector and the financial sector. I think the mood started very positive. Yesterday we had the whole discussions around China, US coming through, and of course with positive start, the fact that they're not going to be engaging in those trade wars, those talks were positive, those announcements were positive, and I think that's what impacted on the market. Yesterday, the Dow rallied quite aggressively. Is then filtering into our market.
Now, I try to, give my little layman's analysis on why the rand has appreciated somewhat. What's your analysis of why it's appreciated? Is it just a US dollar factor, or are there some peculiar things happening in South Africa as well?
Yeah, look, the big influence of the rand-dollar exchange rate is certainly the dollar. The dollar has been strengthening. It has strengthened against the euro over the past couple of weeks. It strengthened against the yen, and this is on the back of the rising yields. We had the 10-year yields on the U.S. Treasury climbing above 3%. In fact, it touched 3.1%. So that, that obviously is very inflationary going forward. It tells you that perhaps the Fed might also change the monetary policy and begin to hike a bit more aggressive if we continue to see those yields rising. So the weakness that we saw on the rand, it's really not much to do with the weaker rand. It's more to do with the stronger dollar. So you are absolutely right.
Okay. And then in terms of, you touched on the Fed, their minutes of their 1st and 2nd of May meeting, they're coming out tomorrow. What's the expectation? Because people are uncertain. Are there going to be 3 rate hikes or 4 rate hikes? What's your expectation and why?
Yeah, look, I think even though it's still early days to say whether would they change their stance, there are signs which says that might happen, especially if we continue to see the yields rise or increase in the U.S. We could actually potentially see the change in the approach by the Fed, and that would be very negative for emerging markets currencies such as the rand, and also including the Turkish lira. They came under a lot of pressure over the past couple of weeks, and I think that pressure would certainly continue if we get the change in the stance of the Fed. So early days, we'll have to read into the minutes and see exactly what the views are, how those the dot plots changes, and to see exactly what impact it will have on the Fed going forward.
Okay. And then retailer, let's take a look at a stock, Verimark. They tend to import a lot of goods from overseas. They came out with their annual results. Their numbers are looking good. Revenue rose 15.7%. Profit before tax was up 25%. And their headline earnings per share were up 32.9% at 31.9 cents. Very impressive. Your thoughts?
Very impressive. I mean, I think also it has to be commented that for a retailer who's delivering double-digit revenue in this difficult environment, certainly doing very well. I think partly what they benefited from there in the last sets of numbers that they just reported is the fact that the rand has strengthened over the same period. So because they import a lot, as you indicated, usually they would import at a higher, when the rand depreciates, that's obviously very costly for them to import those products from overseas, and that impact negatively on their financials. But because we've had the stronger rand, that has also assisted them quite a lot. I see they also declared a dividend. They're paying back their shareholders, and that's very positive. I think very impressive, particularly from a retailer under these environments where retail sector is under a lot of pressure. It
has been quite under a lot of pressure. And interestingly enough as well, they say that they're not going to pass on that 1 percentage point in VAT going forward.
Yeah.
All right, well, that was Maudi Lentsoane. He's from Luhuma Capital. After a short break, Nzinga has more business news for you.